Elena wasn't just Romania's first lady. She was feared. For over 2 decades, she ruled beside one of Europe's most brutal dictators, earning respect from a few, but hatred from many. When their regime collapsed in December 1989, they were executed like criminals on Christmas Day. But decades later, something unexpected happened. Her coffin was opened, and it uncovered horrifying truths. Elena Ceaușescu's life started in hardship. Born on January 7, 1916, in the small Romanian village of Petresti, she came from a poor family of farmers. Life in rural Dâmbovița County was harsh. There were no modern comforts, just long days working the land, and nights lit by candlelight. As a child, Elena helped care for her siblings and worked beside her parents in the fields. She wasn't known for being clever or curious in school. In fact, she struggled to keep up and left early, never finishing her basic education. But what she lacked in intelligence, she made up for with sheer stubbornness. She didn't like being dismissed or ignored. And even as a young girl, she had a fierce need to prove herself. In the early 1930s, like many others looking for a better life, Elena moved to Bucharest. It was a city still rough around the edges, but full of promise. She took on whatever small jobs she could find, surviving more on willpower than skill. In 1939, she managed to get work as a lab assistant at the Ice Institute, even though she had no background in science. That job, however, would change her life forever. It was there she met Nicolae Ceaușescu, a quiet, serious man, already making a name for himself in the underground communist movement. He wasn't impressive on the outside, but he was driven. Arrested multiple times for his political work, Nicolae seemed fearless, and Elena admired that. They were both outsiders trying to climb a system that wasn't built for people like them. After World War II, Romania's political system shifted dramatically. The communists gained power, and Nicolae moved up with them. Elena stayed close by his side, and in 1947 they married. It wasn't a grand affair, but it sealed a bond that would carry them both to the top. Romania was being reshaped, and the Ceaușescus were determined to shape it in their image. Elena quickly learned how to move through the political maze. She didn't win people over with charm or ideas. She used loyalty, flattery, and quiet intimidation. She knew how to stay close to those in power and how to push aside anyone who threatened her path. Bit by bit, she transformed herself from a farmer's daughter into a political player. People started to notice she wasn't just the wife of a rising star. She was a force of her own. She wasn't elected, she didn't study, and she didn't lead through inspiration. She built her position through relentless ambition and her husband's growing influence. And as the 1970s began, she had fully stepped into the spotlight, but not as a traditional first lady. She wasn't there just for the ceremony. She had worked her way into Romania's highest political spaces, quietly taking control where others would have expected her to stay silent. She claimed to be a brilliant chemist, receiving fake degrees, titles, and endless praise from state-controlled institutions. Her name was attached to scientific papers she never wrote, and awards were handed to her at rigged ceremonies. It became a national joke, whispered behind closed doors, but no one dared laugh out loud. Speaking against Elena, even in private, could cost someone their career, or worse. Her image was everywhere. Newspapers printed glowing articles about her genius. TV broadcasts called her the mother of the nation. School children were taught to honor her as a scientific and moral leader. Her portrait hung next to Nicolae's in classrooms and government buildings, as if they were gods watching over the country. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was obedience. By 1980, Elena was named Vice Prime Minister, one of the highest positions in the land. From that seat, she didn't just observe government decisions, she shaped them. She had final say in economic planning, political appointments, and even academic leadership. Professors, ministers, generals, they all feared her. Many quietly believed she was harsher than Nicolae. When he delivered speeches and appeared at parades, Elena was the one pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Her influence was everywhere, and her wrath was swift. She didn't care about real science, truth, or service. What she wanted was control, and she got it. No one voted for her. No one dared to challenge her. And yet there she was, deciding the fate of millions. But having power wasn't enough for Elena and Nicolae. They wanted to be loved. They wanted to be worshipped. Their faces filled the streets. The cult of personality they built demanded not just loyalty, but devotion. And while the people clapped on command, they were also starving, cold, and afraid, while Romania was heading toward disaster. Nicolae had borrowed heavily from the West in the 1970s, believing that foreign loans could help him transform Romania into a modern industrial powerhouse. But the dream crumbled quickly. The factories he built produced low-quality goods that no one wanted. Farming collapsed due to poor planning and forced collectivization. There was no real profit, just debt piling up. Instead of admitting failure, Nicolae doubled down. He was determined to pay back every dollar to Western creditors, even if it meant pushing his own people to the brink. Elena backed him without hesitation. Together they enforced a crushing austerity plan that gutted the country's economy. Everything became about exporting. Romania began selling off anything of value to earn foreign currency. Grain, oil, steel, and even food that its own people desperately needed. Supermarkets stood empty. People waited in endless lines for a few eggs or a piece of meat. Gasoline was restricted to such low levels that public transportation barely functioned. In hospitals, medicine vanished. Doctors could do little more than watch their patients suffer. Winters were the worst. Heating was shut off in most homes. Families sealed windows with blankets, burned old furniture for warmth, and huddled together in freezing apartments. Children wore 2 coats to school, if they even went. Hospitals were as cold as morgues. In orphanages, babies wrapped in newspapers cried through the night. Many wouldn't make it to spring. And while the nation starved and froze, the Ceaușescus were living like royalty. They dined on imported delicacies, using gold-plated utensils, and enjoyed the comfort of multiple palaces scattered across the country. Elena flaunted designer clothes and foreign perfumes. She hosted elegant parties while children died of preventable diseases just a few miles away. But none of this was ever shown on television. The public only saw carefully crafted propaganda, colorful parades, staged factory tours, smiling workers, and speeches about national success. Nicolae rambled on for hours, delivering lies about progress, while Elena nodded beside him, smiling as if all was well. But the real Romania lived in fear. The Securitate, one of the most brutal secret police forces in Eastern Europe, they controlled everything. They tapped phones, listened through walls, and encouraged people to inform on each other. Parents whispered in their own homes, afraid that children might repeat something at school. A simple complaint could lead to arrest, torture, or even death. People vanished without a trace. Fear was the regime's strongest weapon, and Elena knew how to use it well. But history doesn't stay frozen. All it took was one moment, one spark in the right place, and everything began to unravel. That spark came on December 16, 1989, in the city of Timișoara. It started with a small protest. Locals had gathered outside the home of Hungarian pastor Laszlo Tokes, who was being evicted for criticizing the regime. At first it was peaceful, just neighbors showing support. But word spread quickly. More people joined, and then even more. By evening, the crowd was massive. And they weren't just defending a pastor anymore. They were openly defying the dictatorship. The regime reacted as it always did, with brute force. Soldiers arrived and opened fire. Tanks rolled into the streets, tear gas filled the air. Civilians were gunned down in front of their families. Blood ran through the streets. Bodies were taken away in trucks, dumped into unmarked graves. The government thought this would scare the rest of the country into silence. But this time, fear didn't work. Something had changed. The people of Romania had reached their breaking point. Instead of retreating, they stood their ground. The grief of Timișoara turned into determination. In the days that followed, protests spread like wildfire, first in nearby cities like Arad and Cluj, then to Bucharest. Every hour, the crowds grew larger. Tens of thousands poured into the streets, chanting not just for food or heat, but for freedom. On December 21st, Nicolae tried to take control of the situation. He gave a live speech from the balcony of the Communist Party headquarters in Bucharest. Elena stood beside him, smiling stiffly as always. But for the first time, the crowd didn't cheer. They booed. They shouted. Some threw stones. For a moment, Nicolae looked stunned, like he couldn't understand what was happening. His face turned pale. Elena's smile faded. The broadcast cut off suddenly. It was the first crack in the wall that had held firm for decades. By the next morning, the regime was collapsing. Crowds swarmed the streets, riots broke out. Soldiers started joining the people. Entire army units refused to fire on civilians. Some even turned their weapons on the Securitate. The Ceaușescus tried to act like they were still in control, but it was over. On December 22nd, with chaos just outside their door, they made a final desperate move. They fled the Communist Party building in a helicopter, hoping to outrun the revolution. But they didn't get far. A revolution was already chasing them. By the afternoon of December 22, 1989, the Ceaușescus were no longer in control. Their regime had crumbled within hours, and the people they once ruled were now hunting them down. After escaping by helicopter from the Central Committee building in Bucharest, Nicolae and Elena thought they might still find safety. But the pilot, sensing the winds had changed, made a critical decision. He faked an engine failure and landed in a field near Titu. Waiting soldiers quickly surrounded the area and arrested the former dictator and his wife without resistance. They had once held absolute power. Now they were prisoners. The couple was taken to a military base in Târgoviște, where they were locked in a cold, bare room, no advisors, no comforts. Just a single bed and armed guards. For the first time in decades, they were completely alone. Nicolae continued to act like he was still president, demanding respect and insisting he was the rightful leader. Elena was furious and combative, yelling at soldiers and refusing to believe their authority. But the revolution was moving fast, and outside those walls, the streets were erupting. Gunfire, protests, and confusion swept the country as loyalists tried to hold on and revolutionaries pushed forward. Rumors of a rescue attempt terrified the new provisional government. They feared that if the Ceaușescus survived the night, their supporters might strike back. So on Christmas Day, December 25th, the government made a final decision. They would hold a trial right there at the base. It was not a proper courtroom. A few military officials and legal personnel were flown in, and within hours, Nicolae and Elena were called in for a swift and brutal hearing. The charges were heavy, including genocide, abuse of power, corruption, and economic collapse. The trial lasted less than an hour. They had no defense team. They weren't allowed to present their side. It was more of a formality than a legal process. A final stamp on a regime already buried by the people. The sentence was immediate: death by firing squad. Moments later, the two were dragged into the courtyard. Elena resisted, shouting, kicking, refusing to believe it was real. Nicolae tried to sing the national anthem one last time, as if trying to hold on to some shred of dignity or control. But no one cared anymore. They were tied to wooden posts beside each other. The order was given. At 2:45 p.m., bullets tore through their bodies. The execution was over in seconds. Blood spilled across the courtyard, staining the cold November snow. A soldier laid a coat over Elena's remains, but there were no final rites. The Ceaușescus died as outcasts, gunned down in a back courtyard, discarded by the very system they once ruled with terror. It was a brutal, fast ending for two people who had once demanded to be worshipped like royalty. Now they lay in the dirt, and Romania turned the page. But what happened to their bodies next would become one of the most questioned and debated moments in Romania's modern history. After the execution, Romanian officials acted fast. The bodies of Elena and Nicolae were flown by military helicopter back to Bucharest. There was no ceremony, no delay, and no public announcement. Everything was done quietly under tight control. The government didn't want a spectacle, nor did it want the graves to become shrines for supporters or targets for angry citizens. The burial took place at Ghencea Cemetery, a large graveyard in the capital. It was carried out under military supervision with only a few witnesses. There was no crowd, no priest, and no mourning family members. The plot was unmarked at first. For a long time, only those in power knew exactly where the bodies were placed. Eventually, 2 stone crosses were added. Simple inscriptions appeared, reading their names. But silence turned into suspicion. Whispers began almost immediately. People started questioning whether the Ceaușescus had really been buried there. Some claimed the bodies had been switched. Others believed they were buried in different locations entirely, possibly to prevent vandalism or political attention. The secrecy fed the rumors, and the government's refusal to release official documents only deepened public doubt. Even those connected to the family had questions. Mircea Opran, the husband of the Ceaușescu's adopted daughter Zoya, openly demanded proof. He wanted confirmation that the graves were real and not part of another state cover-up. But for years, no one gave him answers. For over 2 decades, the graves remained quiet. No flowers, no visitors, just 2 names carved into stone. But beneath the silence was a nation still haunted by its past. The Ceaușescus had ruled with fear, and even in death, they left behind a legacy of uncertainty. On the morning of July 21, 2010, a forensic team from the Romanian Institute of Legal Medicine arrived at the Ghencea Cemetery. They were not there to pay respects, but to dig up the past. After years of speculation, pressure from the Ceaușescu's family, and growing public interest, the government finally approved the exhumation. The goal was to confirm once and for all that Nicolae and Elena were truly buried in those graves. Cameras rolled as the team carefully unearthed the burial site. Elena's coffin was opened first. Inside lay a fragile, decayed body, its white hair still visible, tangled and long. She was still wearing a white wool jacket, eerily preserved by time and the cold soil. It was a haunting sight. The team worked methodically, collecting DNA samples from her bones, hair strands, and clothing. Then they turned to Nicolae's grave. His coffin, too, was lifted and opened. The remains inside showed the toll of time, but enough had survived for testing. More samples were taken, and the process was documented thoroughly. It had taken over 2 decades, but Romania was finally trying to answer a question that had lingered like a shadow since 1989. Not long after the exhumation, the Romanian Institute of Legal Medicine released the results. There was no more room for doubt. The remains found in the graves did in fact belong to Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu. DNA from the bones was compared with samples taken from their surviving son, Valentin Ceaușescu. The match was exact. The decades-old rumors were finally put to rest. Even with the mystery solved, the emotional weight of that moment stayed with the country. The image of Elena's decaying body, her white jacket still intact, lingered in people's minds. It wasn't just a scientific procedure. It was a confrontation, a reckoning. For many Romanians, seeing her coffin opened felt like reopening a wound they had tried so hard to forget. Because Elena hadn't just been a dictator's wife. She had played her own role, one that was cold, calculated, and ruthless. The truth was confirmed, but the scars remained. Today, Elena's grave sits in a quiet part of Ghencea Cemetery. It's simple, no flowers, no tourists, just a piece of stone with her name. Some Romanians avoid the place. Others visit out of curiosity, but not one forgets what she did.